Welcome, everyone. My name is Peggy Mason, and I'm the president of the Rideau Institute. But I'm here today in my capacity as a board member and past chair of the Group of 78. Its current chair, Roy Culpepper, is unavoidably absent. The Group of 78 is an Ottawa-based national NGO dedicated to promoting global priorities for peace and disarmament, equitable and sustainable development, and a strong and revitalized United Nations system. And it is the sponsor of today's most timely webinar. The horrific war in Ukraine is receiving nonstop media coverage, as you all know, but our focus, what Ukraine tells us about nuclear deterrence and common security, is almost invisible in that media coverage. Today, I have the privilege of being the moderator for two fantastic speakers, the Canadian Network to Abolish Nuclear Weapons co-chair Robin Collins and the executive director of Project Plowshares, Cesar Jaramillo. Both have grappled for many years with the challenges of making progress towards the indispensable but elusive goal of nuclear disarmament. As our webinar promotional material states, in the shadow of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, I hope to explore with Robin and Cesar what the crisis may mean for nuclear disarmament goals, European security, NATO's reliance on nuclear deterrence, and challenges to the UN and UN Charter framework itself. A tall order for an hour and 15 minutes, but hopefully we can make some progress to that end. Let me start with a key question I hope we can explore further. Then I will turn it over to Robin and Cesar in that order to give opening statements of 10 minutes each. That will be followed by what I hope will be a lively discussion between them, with my encouragement, for about 15 minutes. Then we will turn to audience questions, bearing in mind we can continue until 2:15 if necessary to ensure we get to as many audience questions as we can. Note that you can use the question function to type in your questions. Now to my overriding preoccupation. Surely one of the most significant aspects of Russia's illegal invasion and the resulting terrible conflict in Ukraine is the lack of direct military engagement between Russia and NATO, despite the alliance's massive involvement in arming Ukraine. That lack of direct NATO-Russia military engagement is precisely because NATO has calculated that the risk of escalation to nuclear war is just too great. This realization, in turn, calls into immediate question all of NATO's doctrine and planning and spending for conventional warfighting with Russia, not to mention in support of the insane concept of limited nuclear warfighting. But this has not been the lesson focused on or even much mentioned in media commentary, with the welcome exception today of a Globe and Mail editorial entitled, "What's the War About? Defending Ukraine, not defeating Russia, there's a difference." The hawks who refuse to believe that NATO expansion to Russia's doorstep via Ukraine was a red line for Russia, and therefore steps had to be taken to address legitimate Russian security concerns, are now seen as completely vindicated by the Russian attack. Somehow it proves the invasion was inevitable all along, rather than potentially the result of no meaningful efforts to prevent it, most notably through genuine Western support for some version of the Minsk agreements, combined with NATO being honest about Ukraine's non-admission to NATO for any foreseeable future. I mean, of course, Ukraine was going to choose NATO over neutrality so long as it thought NATO membership was a viable possibility. So the prevailing view and lesson now is, as Andrew Coyne put it in the Globe and Mail on Monday, quote, rearmament on all sides, further NATO enlargement, the attempted diplomatic and economic isolation of Russia, and permanent sanctions until Putin is gone, end quote. All the while, the existential threats of climate change and the destruction of nature continue, and the now heightened existential threat of nuclear Armageddon remains completely unaddressed by this conventional rearmament response. In short, given that there is no defense against nuclear weapons except deterring their use in the first place, how does rearmament on all sides reduce the nuclear threat, especially in circumstances where Russia becomes progressively more disadvantaged in conventional terms, as well as economically and politically? That is my question, but there are many more, and I'm sure the audience will have many. Now let us turn without delay to our first speaker, Robin Collins, then we'll hear from Cesar. Robin, over to you.
Thanks, Peggy. That's a great introduction. I hardly even need to respond because you've incorporated many of the ideas I think all of us have been talking about. There was a recent prolonged but healthy process that led to a Group of 78 statement on the Ukraine-Russia conflict recently. The contention was over the extent to which the statement should focus on condemnation of Russia versus the relative importance of the context within which the invasion occurred. A broadly supported statement was achieved. Out there in the world, though, and at the United Nations, things don't always achieve consensus or a peaceful end like that. Obvious reasons for this include the existence of competing powerful states, tribal and nationalist zealots, tantalizing economic spoils, and spheres of influence that sustain them, and I would say, most significantly, an absent shared common security norm. Oh, if only we had more common security. Well, we do have some in place, and I will return to this positive note at the end. As we all know, there is a range of opinion and prediction about how the Ukraine-Russia conflict will play out and eventually end. At one poll, some believe that Ukraine will win, defeat Russia. Russia will fold up their tent, be weakened and reluctant to ever invade again. The Donbass and even Crimea will return into the orbit of Ukraine, which will democratize, improve language rights for the Russian minority, stabilize, join the European Union, join or not join NATO, and all will be good. At the other end, the other pole, Ukraine's immediate successes will be reversed in Donbass. Russia will incorporate the east and maybe even the south of Ukraine, and the peace deal will result in neutrality for Kiev, that is, no NATO membership. NATO states will deftly handle the military situation and avoid getting directly involved. NATO, the US, and the West will sacrifice Ukraine's sovereignty. Putin will avoid embarrassment and regime change and go on to expand further or not expand further and fight another day. There are many predictions. There are many variations on these predictions. Nobody knows what will happen, and anybody who claims to know does not. There is risk if Ukraine fights on bravely. There is risk if Ukraine capitulates early and prematurely. We do know that we are on the brink of possibly widening this war into a regional war, or perhaps less likely a global war or a nuclear war. That latter threat is what is keeping NATO and Putin on their tippy toes. This implies that having nuclear weapons might give you a free ride because we suspect that Russia would not have attacked Ukraine if Ukraine was in NATO. NATO might have directly responded militarily to Russia if Russia didn't have nuclear weapons. NATO might respond to Russia militarily if Russia moves beyond Ukraine into a NATO member state. And Russia will not move beyond Ukraine because NATO will respond militarily, also possibly not leading to nuclear war. All those guesses are based on nuclear deterrence doctrine working according to plan, that is, threat of annihilation. We can say that on one level at least, nuclear deterrence is working, which is an uncomfortable thing to say from an abolitionist point of view, but this is a quite specific form of deterrence, which is deterring nuclear weapons use, not deterrence that would prevent invasion or even military escalation. Russia did invade Ukraine, which has at least some risk of escalation. that we are now watching in real time. And Russia will probably not invade Poland due to further escalation risk. Probably. We know that with nuclear deterrence, even if it works, and it is far better that it works than that it does not work, the stability it enshrines is a very fraught form of insecurity because, like during the Cold War, it sets up and allows proxy wars and enables invasions all over the globe. From 1990 to 2017, after the Cold War ended, it is estimated that the US alone has intervened militarily around the globe more than 120 times. There's no simple fix for aggression that does not involve more weapons. Nuclear deterrence certainly does not remove contention and conflict. It may limit it, but at a very high cost. In particular, it reinforces the existential threat or risk of possible nuclear war, which could be started unintentionally, accidentally, or be triggered by just one mistaken assumption, one errant missile. Some war game experts have predicted that any war between NATO and Russia, or Russia and the USA, will inevitably lead to nuclear war. Let's assume that both the Russian and the US leadership know this too. Even as peace talks collapse and Putin launches a missile at Kiev during the visit of the UN Secretary General, and the talk in Washington and in many media ranges within the narrow band of long war options that extend from victory for Ukraine to weakening Russia, with little consideration for the plight of Ukrainians. As peace activists and advocates, we are loath to ever support initiation or prolongation of war, and therefore many of us push for a peace process at almost any cost, even if, as we are berated, this looks and smells like appeasement or capitulation to raw power and aggression. It is so difficult, though, isn't it, not to admire the resistance of Ukrainians pushing back, even winning briefly. We must admit, too, that how Ukrainians fare at the eventual bargaining table is probably contingent on the success of their resistance. But meanwhile, it is the civilians and infrastructure that needlessly suffer. And let's not leave out the soldiers, be they professionals, press gang volunteers, or otherwise, who die in large numbers. This is tragedy. It is not glory. The only alternative to the two mainstream choices for Ukraine of capitulation or military victory is common security, with its focus on prevention of military conflict, which is manifestly elusive. Still, we can get pieces of it. We can move towards it. We can work to end the war and worry about the rest later. But absent common security, nuclear deterrence mostly restrains the military response to aggression within the bounds of conventional war, without any real confidence that that restraint will actually work in the real world. We may be a long way from global adoption of cooperative or cooperation, replacing competitive national security in international relations. Just look at the record level of military budgets, rising again in part as response to Putin's invasion. But we are not starting from zero either. Olof Palme's 1982 Common Security Project had supporters throughout Nordic and Western European social democratic states, in Nelson Mandela's South Africa, and most importantly, it included the USSR's Mikhail Gorbachev and his meeting with Ronald Reagan in Iceland. Let's not forget, that was during the darkest days of the Cold War. The Palm Commission blueprint argued all states, even the most powerful, are dependent in the end upon the good sense and restraint of other nations. Even ideological and political opponents have a shared interest in survival. In the long run, no nation can base its security on the insecurity of others. True security requires a cooperative effort, a partnership in the struggle against war, end quote. Consider now the just announced pledge by the USA not to deploy anti-satellite weapons in the commons of space. Consider too that Russia is not blocking consensus of the newly established obligation of the UN General Assembly to discuss resolutions vetoed at the UN Security Council. Both these recent measures arrived during a war potentially threatening human survival. Let us hope that is a hopeful sign and not a reification of absurdity. Some of us have pointed out, one moment here, I just rolled by. Some of us have pointed out that common security elements such as a UN peace service, UNEPS, can be implemented just as was UN peacekeeping very early on, absent a full global common security regime. Big changes do happen amid chaos. The new rendition of the common security idea was just released during this war in the heart of Europe. Common Security 2022 has a focus on the trio of global threats: nuclear war, climate change, and pandemics. The core principles include human security, nuclear disarmament and reduced military spending, trust and confidence building measures between peoples and nations, regional cooperation, and respect for international law. At the same moment, though, states like Sweden and Finland, not to mention Moldova, Georgia, or Ukraine, ponder joining the NATO alliance to protect themselves from Russian aggression. But we should consider NATO as a symptom of the underlying problem, not its primary cause. The disease is so much greater than NATO. We need more mutual security, much more than the version that NATO offers, not less of it. That is why we often look to the Common Security Blueprint for Survival of 1982 and the birth of the OSCE in the early 1970s, which is promoted by many in the peace movement as a better, more transparent, less militarized monitoring approach to security. Absent in that list, you will notice, is enforcement. In April of this year, just last month, the 57-member OSCE did not shy away from releasing its 108-page report, slamming Russia for being the author of the bulk of war crimes in Ukraine. The report read in part unambiguously, recognizing they occurred on both sides of the conflict. War crimes violations committed by the Russian Federation, however, are by far larger in scale and nature. The premises of common security are mostly self-evident: prevention of war, diminution of conflict, rapid response, democratization, diplomacy, not arms races, nuclear weapon abolition, risks reduction, mutual vulnerability, the United Nations Charter. But go tell a superpower that global peace depends on their ending arms racing, their sharing of security resources, their reducing provocative defense postures so that none of us can threaten anyone else. There is the challenge of getting to global common security, of course. Last point, we have a lot more work to do to make a common security future possible, palatable, and feasible. Sometimes the crisis of war provides the focus needed for a kickstart. We shall see.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin, very much. There's a lot of food for thought there, some cautiously optimistic points as well. And I'm going to turn it right over to Cesar. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Peggy, very much, and thanks to the Group of 78 for organizing this event and for the kind invitation. My way, always a pleasure to be with you and Robin in these conversations. So I'll try to be brief and leave sufficient time for discussion afterwards and debate with Robin. Although I shouldn't say debate because I found myself concurring with pretty much every point that Robin raised. But a few reflections of where we find ourselves now and in terms of the Ukraine crisis. But I would start by highlighting a point Robin made that it may seem self-evident, but no one knows really at the end of the day how this may unfold and and this is in a way, admittedly, an exercise in some speculation, and even the initial invasion and Putin's decision to go in dumbfounded many analysts and pundits, and so any calculations should or anything that seems to be a hard prediction, I would advise, even if coming from me, to take with a grain of salt, because really it's a moving situation, and no one knows. So a few reflections. So first of all, I think there's two levels of analysis here. I mean, one more short-term and one more longer term. And I think the short-term one, or at least from my perspective, a priority with the immediate, in the immediate way the conflict unfolds, has to be around the priority of avoiding nuclear use and avoiding any escalation to nuclear weapons. That's the immediate priority for the international community. And there must be an understanding that any use of nuclear weapons is the absolute worst case scenario that could emerge out of the Ukraine crisis. Second to none. Second to capitulation in Ukraine, etc. Zelensky president, a puppet, a Moscow puppet as president. No, those are all important factors, but there's all secondary to the possibility of nuclear weapons use. So I think from the peace community, from the perspective of decision makers in the West, in NATO, hopefully whoever is advising Putin and his own calculations, there's a recognition that escalation to nuclear warfare must be avoided. But even if we all know that, there are still potential trigger points today that I'm happy to discuss in a couple of minutes what those may be. But there is a risk, and that is an unacceptable risk, yet it's lingering. So that's the immediate term. On the longer term, I think we have to consider what transatlantic relations are going to look like in the longer term. The impact of this crisis in transatlantic relations, and here I see, and this is admittedly an oversimplification, I see, broadly speaking, two general scenarios. We can the international community can pivot to some of the parameters that Robin was describing around common security or collective security or shared security or whatever, emphasis on diplomacy, on the rule of law, interdependence, etc. Or the international community could pivot to militarizing even further the East-West relations and the relations between NATO and Russia in particular, the U.S. and Russia in particular. And my assessment at this point is that ideally, the international community should be taking this moment to move toward the former scenario: common security, try to decrease military spending, try to take this opportunity to renew the momentum on nuclear disarmament, etc. That's the ideal scenario. But the real scenario and what the signs seem to indicate is that, regrettably, we're moving towards the latter. We're going to see lots of talks, lots of discussions about enlarging NATO. We've already heard Finland, Sweden, with new applicants for membership, and in the domestic context of NATO members, sort of political discussions and political discourse, including in Canada, we're going to start to see more and more uncritical cheerleading for increasing military spending, for being tougher, for sticking it to Putin, for not putting up with bullies. This emboldened, very, very sort of macho rhetoric about arming ourselves to the teeth because the circumstances warranted. And we see that even in Canadian academics, we see this in Canadian media, we see this is sort of in the pundits, in the commentators, in TV. Like if ever circumstances warranted greater military spending, it's now, and it's completely justified, and even being uncritical about it is somewhat justified. And I think that demands a bit of pause and analysis, and that it may create a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy whereby increased military spending creates the condition for further down the line having the impression that even further military spending is necessary. And that's the road we have been in. And in a way, the current crisis, I think, is a result, and not to be at all apologetic about Putin's methods, something about that in a minute, but in a way, the current crisis is a result of an overly militarized approach to East-West relations. So if the outcome of this crisis will be to redouble on that approach that has led us here, I think it's going to be bad news. I think it's going to create the conditions for yet another confrontation, perhaps not over Ukraine, perhaps over another issue, but the underlying risks about nuclear escalation, about this excessive military buildup of conventional weapons, etc., will remain the same. So yeah, I think regrettably, the international community may end up, including in Canada, may end up drawing the wrong lessons from what's happening right now in Ukraine, and move towards an even further militarized approach to relations with the East and with Russia, etc. Now, in this context, I think it's important, and I said not to be apologetic for Putin, and that's certainly not the case, but I think it's important to distinguish Russia's methods from Russia's long-standing grievances. And this is an area where one has to be subtle, because, there's so much pro-Ukraine enthusiasm, rightly so, and sympathy and rejection of the illegal military aggression and invasion by Russia, and I fully concur with that. So the methods that Putin is employing, I think, are unequivocally abhorrent and are to be rejected, and put civilians at risk, and undermines international law and the rules-based international order, all of that. But separately from that, I think we need to recognize, especially in the West, and hopefully including decision makers, that some of the long-standing grievances that Russia has aired have some legitimacy. And I think to say this does not make one a Putin apologist, and to say this doesn't mean that one doesn't see the horrors of the military invasion, the illegality of that invasion, etc. But I think we, policy people should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, and see these two very different distinct dimensions of the crisis. The methods, very bad, criticizable, no doubt. Period. The grievances, I think many of the grievances are real, including about NATO expansion, including about this gradual encroachment closer and closer to Russia's borders, etc. And I see parallel to that, including today, a very obstinate resistance in the West to even recognize that there is any legitimacy to those grievances. And in fact, as the outrage about the invasion itself grows, and about the civilian suffering, and it does deserve and demand outrage, the international community seems to even downplay even more the legitimacy of those grievances. I think we can be outraged about the methods, but still, at some point, we need to consider those grievances, because otherwise we're going to end up in the same place at the same time. Where I see a great risk for escalation in the current scenario is by withdrawing what is traditionally considered unacceptable involvement by NATO. What do I mean by this? Traditionally and historically, the limit is direct sort of troops on the ground, and everybody agrees. If NATO were to send troops there, there's a high risk of escalation, including potentially to nuclear. But that supplying military aid and imposing crippling sanctions upon Russia are acceptable ways that do not constitute direct involvement. Now, I think that has been a historical fact thus far, but it doesn't make it a sacrosanct truth. And I think that Russia, in as much as military aid starts to really shift the tide, and militarily, and to make the war unwinnable for Russia, Putin is going, and we've already seen evidence of that, toughen the language about other things that are short of direct military invasion, and including the provision of military aid, including the imposition of crippling sanctions. And there's no guarantee, and I hope this doesn't happen. But should Russia make that as red a line as direct military involvement, say, well, no more military aid, and we will consider it an aggression, we will retaliate or something, that could potentially be pose an escalatory risk if these behaviors that are currently ongoing are all of a sudden framed as unacceptable, categorically unacceptable by Russia, and they act accordingly. Putin, both sides there is a PR war as well, and they offer tough words, but Putin just 2 days ago, very clearly saying, don't test our patience. Military aid is not acceptable. So we'll see where that goes, but I do see a potential pitfall for vulnerability and for escalation. Another point that I would like to raise has to do with because it's an area that we follow at Project Plowshares, some of you may be familiar, the enthusiasm for arming Ukraine right now, and the risks inherent with that enthusiasm with arming Ukraine. I think it's only natural, for solidarity, alliances, doing the right thing, resisting aggression, resisting autocrats. So it's somewhat understandable that there's a momentum and impetus to arm Ukraine. But this doesn't mean that all arms controls, all export controls around military transfer that have taken so long for the international community to develop should be completely disregarded. And the fact that there is sympathy towards Ukraine, rightly so, I think they deserve a lot of sympathy, doesn't mean that these transfers are risk-free. And the expedited nature in which they're happening is going to create a condition, where it's virtually impossible to even track, to even try to track where these weapons will go. We know Zelensky has been on the record arming civilians. We don't know to which extent these are foreign weapons or domestic weapons. We do know that or it's safe to assume that conditions are ripe now for a well-entrenched insurgency and a long-lived insurgency. So this question of sort of arming Ukraine and with little control over expedited processes should raise at least some questions about what controls, if any, are in place to safeguard some of the worst outcomes that traditionally are associated with arms exports. On the question of nuclear deterrence, I say that this is a scenario that is evolving in real time, and that it is for policy nerds like some of us, it's tragic as the situation is. It's a very instructive, sort of real-time scenario. We've been talking hypothetically about, for years about what might happen, and we have a real life scenario where you have Russia on the one side and NATO with its own nuclear deterrent on the other, and how these dimensions play out. I think that one truth that may be hard to swallow, including for myself and for many in the abolitionist movements, is that I think that for Putin in the very discrete scenario of making NATO have second thoughts about any direct military intervention, that the nuclear deterrent has worked. For better or worse, I think that it's hard to argue that it hasn't worked. I mean, there's a very real reason, and it's that why NATO is so hesitant to have more direct military intervention, and it has to do in part with the nuclear deterrent, the Russian nuclear deterrent. And this is not necessarily good news or a symptom of stability, as Robin well highlighted. This is a very fragile security with fraught with risk. But in that particular scenario, the nuclear deterrent of Putin seems to have worked. At the same time, the nuclear deterrent of NATO, which has long been framed as the supreme guarantee, as if it's watertight. There's nothing that is so supreme, this guarantee, but all of a sudden it doesn't seem so supreme. And the fact that there's this nuclear deterrent on the other side, and still it's giving NATO pause. It's good thing on the one, a good thing that they're having such a cautious approach. But I think at the end of the day, the nuclear deterrent of NATO is no guarantee of anything, as Ernie Regier put it in a paper recently. Because it's it's in the face of these very fraught circumstances, it's very unpredictable the impact that it may have. And the last point to finalize his remarks, I'm happy to expand on these points, is that on the question of common security and whether the international community pivots towards common security or pivots towards more militarized approaches to Ukraine, I'd be remiss if I didn't sort of publicly lament the lack of leadership and the lack of political leadership in the West for making even the semblance of a case for common security. It's almost predictable, sort of parroting the 2% military spending line that we have all heard before, and this enthusiasm for to be and seem strong and armed to the teeth and all of that, and not so much in terms of parallel to I guess some military responses. Was the focus on diplomacy? Was going to be the focus on dispute resolution? It was going to be the focus on rule of law and relying on that. What are the benefits versus the downsides of excluding Russia from the Arctic Council or from the International Space Station, or do we need the opposite to keep them integrated so that dialogue continues? And these are questions that aren't getting enough attention. All the response is framed around strength and framing and having a very strong response to Russian aggression, which is once again predictable enough. But I think this is coming to the detriment of a very necessary conversation about common security, about prioritizing diplomatic endeavors, etc. So I'll leave it there for now, and happy to expand on some of these points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cesar. Well, we've had a lot put on the table with our two speakers. I'm going to pick up on one point, and then I've got a couple of questions before we go to our audience questions. Talking about the response, the defense industry. I mean, earlier on in your discussion, Cesar, you were talking about, the calls for yet more spending. And in my view, that's taking advantage of the fear and horror of Canadians or the general publics of NATO countries over the war in Ukraine. It seems to me that there's no evidence whatsoever that a lack of NATO defense spending was the cause of this conflict. I mean, I think it's useful in this era of we've all got to spend more to remind ourselves that the US alone, never mind NATO, vastly exceeds Russia in military spending. I mean, the US defense budget alone is bigger than the next 11 countries combined, including China and Russia. And I also would point out that I think that Russian conventional capability was vastly exaggerated by NATO. This was part of their justification for having to spend all this money, just as they did. For those of us that can remember this in the Cold War, it turned out that the Russian conventional capability was vastly overrated. But it seems to me, and this goes back to your point about legitimate grievances, not only was a lack of NATO defense spending not a contributing factor to the Ukraine conflict, in my view, quite the opposite is much more likely the case. Russia fears NATO and does not want a NATO country and NATO missiles right on its doorstep. And I think that's why it opposed so vociferously, Ukraine's membership in NATO. So, but what I want to do now, in terms of questions, I mean, I want to ask you. I want to come back to you, Cesar, about nuclear risk reduction, because I think you've done a really good. You've painted the picture of the nuclear risks and the Damocles sword. But just before we get to that, I want to really pick up with Robin, because this comes out of also what both of you have said. The inability of NATO to directly respond to Russia militarily because of the risk of escalation potentially to nuclear war means that there is no sufficient military deterrence against Russian conventional attacks on non-NATO states. And that, that's what we're seeing, a Russian conventional attack on Ukraine, a non-NATO state. And no amount of NATO spending is going to change that. So I know, Robin, you talked a bit about common security, but just in that frame, what would you say? What can we do to get us sort of out of this box of the world being safe for great powers to engage in conventional attacks at great cost? Because the sanctions, of course, are not just hurting Russia. The sanctions are hurting the global economy and great suffering in developing countries on the cost of food prices, for example. So even that aspect of the Western response is certainly not cost-free. So I'll turn to you, Robin, first, but then, of course, if Cesar wants to jump in too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I think I would divide common security into short-term, long-term. So immediate and then improving the world's lot so that we don't end up where we are now, because it'll be a repeating problem. So there is this immediate urgency to stopping the war, for a ceasefire, to getting a peace agreement, to managing the situation so that the worst case doesn't happen, which is, as Cesar said, I mean, everything is off the table if until nuclear weapons are off the table. So we can go through the problem of a nuclear weapon state by threatening nuclear weapon use, getting whatever it wants. That is a dilemma that we are faced with just by the fact of there being nuclear weapon states. And I think that's a fear of so-called appeasement or capitulation to Putin because of his raising of the nuclear threat. But as Cesar said, his methods are awful. That doesn't mean there are not grievances that should be addressed that happen to likely also lead us to a peace agreement here. So we need to disconnect the threat from Putin causing appeasement from the necessity of doing what needs to be done to get to a peace agreement. That is the most urgent thing, ending the war and a ceasefire. And I think it's still safe to say that, the Ukrainian resistance gives Ukraine a better deal at the table. But let's put that aside, because that can lead in many bad directions, including the one that we keep hearing about, which is, Ukraine, can win this war and so on. So on the short term, we need to get to the peace agreement. On the longer term, the prevention elements, the cooperation that the globe needs to get into, so that this kind of thing doesn't happen long. This is a very complicated problem, but at the same time, as I had listed, there are many elements of this already in place. It's not a new idea, but we have to deal with the fact of powerful states, and to what extent we can move powerful states towards a more cooperative arrangement. I mean, the cost factor will be one. The fact that the world shares existential threats, the reality of that is another. To the extent that public opinion can be generated and civil society can be involved, that we use the UN forum to discuss these things and to move forward. I mean, the whole list of cooperatives, I'll put in the chat here, maybe on the website later, I'll put in a couple of the documents that illustrate or illuminate what common security is. I mean, to a large extent, it's self-evident. We all know what it's about: cooperation and prevention of conflict, so that you don't have to talk about responding to conflict or responding to aggression. We don't want that to happen in the first place. So I'll leave it there for the moment. You're on mute there.
Okay, thank you. Yes. So Cesar, I don't know if you want to jump in on that as well.
Sure. I mean, on the common security question, or on the nuclear issue that you raised.
Either
earlier.
or both. I mean, one of the things we haven't talked about, but it's a whole area, is reducing what we can do now to reduce nuclear risk. Right.
I think it's a central element of the conversation. So yeah, if I may, I'll sort of a couple of comments. But first, I'd like to react to what you said earlier. Peggy, this is somebody was tweeting just some weeks ago that this is Christmas Day for the weapons industry and in the West, and this is payday, and shareholders must be happy, and I think there's going to be a lot of momentum. There already is a lot of momentum and impetus for arming ourselves, for arming Ukraine, and I know this is not a conversation about the military-industrial complex, but I think there's a lot of sort of strategic reasons why also there's a bit of impetus to this overly militarize Ukraine. In terms of the nuclear risks, I think Peggy, I would first point to, I think we need to consider the reasons that are usually given exceptional, as they may be framed, when the use of nuclear weapons might be considered, and they all, depending on the nuclear arms states, but generally it's you've heard this, when the vital securities of the state are threatened, or the very survival of the state, and one might add the continuity of the current government or something like that. But when vital interests are really objectively threatened, that's where the threat of nuclear weapons use might be highest. So I think in terms of risk reduction, I think politically and in terms of communications and in terms of messaging, both sides need to make clear what the extent of their ultimate goals is, and make it clear in a way to the other side that that the continuity of their state is not being threatened, that those vital security interests, and in Putin's case that may include the continuity of his own government or the absence of threats around regime change. I think if that is clear, that takes away some of the tension, because it sort of precludes some of the scenarios that would justifiably make some of these decision makers invoke nuclear weapons. But beyond the Ukraine crisis itself, some of the risk reduction measures that can be taken in the context of nuclear weapons are no different than what they would have been before Russia invaded Ukraine, or what they will be, hopefully after this has subsided. There are known objectives for the nuclear abolition movement. The removal of tactical nuclear weapons from Europe, for example. As many of the participants will know, the NATO is itself a nuclear alliance, and U.S. bombs are physically stationed in the territories of five otherwise officially non-nuclear weapon states in Italy, and in Belgium, in Germany, in Turkey, in the Netherlands, and this is perhaps a bit of an oversimplified argument, but the U.S. would never allow an inverse situation where 5 countries relatively close to its territory are hosting Russian nuclear weapons, and we know the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So these are destabilizing sort of behaviors. Adoption of no first use policies, for example, which has been talked about in the context of the Biden U.S. nuclear posture review on the Biden administration, but seems to be discarded at this point. Earnest engagement in multilateral processes related to nuclear disarmament, 2 of which are happening this year. Very importantly, the NPT review conference and the first meeting of the nuclear ban treaty. Hopefully, the Ukrainian crisis will not derail the progress that could be achieved at these forums. Fortunately, a bit of a silver lining, and also evidence that arms control negotiations can occur even in the most challenging of circumstances. And Peggy, you and I were sort of talking about this yesterday. That there's some hope that New START, for instance, that there can be progress on the New START treaty even in the context of this crisis. So that that's evidence that parallel to the posturing and to the rhetoric and to the actual aggressions, etc., there can be an emphasis on arms control, and one that I would argue is more necessary now than ever. Because the risk is clear. So short answer is not. There are some things that are specific to this crisis, but more broadly on the question of reducing nuclear dangers, the answers are not that different from what they have been all along for many years. The states need to take this question of nuclear abolition seriously and act accordingly. And the reality, just to finalize that thought, the reality is that today there is not even an inkling of a credible process that would make any reasonable observer believe that we're on the path to abolition. There is nothing, if anything, the opposite. So yeah, in as much as the states involved and observer states, Canada and others are from the periphery, start to prioritize nuclear disarmament and take this crisis as a catalyst for progress, there might well be a silver lining at the end of the day.
So I wanted to make just a comment on and a question, Cesar, your perception of this phenomenon that we see. First, I wanted to also mention, as Peggy did in her opening comments, the Globe and Mail editorial, which is actually a fairly remarkable editorial. It raises some of the issues that nobody else in government seemed to be willing to raise. That is about de-escalation and not calling for regime change and this kind of thing. Although at the same time, and this is the weakness of the editorial, it does say, well, let's keep arming Ukraine. And I say problematic in the sense of, does this lead to stalemate, prolonged war, escalation of war? We don't know. But that the Globe could have considered that as a highly risky venture as well as some of the others. But my question, Cesar, was, what do you make of the fact that you can get New START being discussed by Russia and the United States in the middle of this confrontation war? This is the magic of diplomacy. It offers a great deal of hope, assuming that it does happen. I mentioned a couple of other examples as well of things going on in the midst of war. But what do you make of it? It almost seems to me like there's a game. There is the unspoken, what we're doing in the background and the rhetoric on the surface. Highly risky rhetoric that could potentially leading to destruction and annihilation and to nuclear weapons and so on. But we have this other thing going on at the same time. What do you make of that?
Right. It's a very interesting question, and perhaps I can speculate a little bit. But one of the in this game scenario that you portray, and I agree, there's some of that in these conflicts. Is perhaps people have the mistaken assumption that when there is an armed conflict, each of the sides goes all out with all they have, with all they can muster at once, and not really. There's an evolving understanding by both sides of what's acceptable and what's not, and where the limits lie, and what can still happen parallel to the fighting, and and peculiarly, New START has been among those processes that continue. I think it's driven by self-interest at the end of the day, or I like to think that it's driven by self-interest by the end of the day. And because they see it strategically important to achieve the objectives of New START, even in the context of this crisis. So, but that should give us hope, that there can be. It's not all sort of a catch-all sort of approach to the crisis, but that these governments have the ability to discriminate between one approach and the other. But I think in order why a full understanding or a better understanding of the objectives may be elusive today is because the end game for NATO and for Russia is not clear. It's not clear to me. It's not clear, or people I've spoken to. So, what would make Putin happy at the end of the day? And happy, I'm not sure if that's the way to put it. Well, but what would constitute a face-saving sort of mission accomplished scenario where he can go back to his people, to the generals, to Russia, and say mission accomplished? It's not clear to me. At one point, it seemed it was the whole of Ukraine. They'd taken Kyiv, but they were denied that military victory. Now they seem to be redefining, and to a more modest objective in the eastern regions. But it's not clear. Likewise for NATO. Arming Ukraine, and perhaps it's not inherently good or bad unless you ask the question, okay, to what goal? Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, to what goal? I think it's no mystery the concept of a protracted war. They can continue arming Ukraine, and Russia can continue fighting a medium intensity conflict till the cows come home, sort of thing. So I think from the Western perspective, and especially in Ireland, there has to be a clear answer to that. A very clear answer. Arming Ukraine, to what extent? To deny Russia a decisive victory? I think they have already accomplished that. To give Ukraine a decisive one, I don't know what that means or what that would look like. So I think there's a responsibility on the part of decision makers to have clarity, to achieve clarity on what the ultimate goal is, but also on our end to demand answers to those questions, especially in the context of Canada. Okay, we're supplying Ukraine with military aid. Why? To what extent? I mean, some of it is self-explanatory, and it's solidarity and helping out, etc. But I think the medium term and longer term has to be asked. Okay, what's the end game? And it's remarkable. 2 months in, we don't know the end game for either side. What really might be the objective? What might constitute a face-saving sort of scenario, and what might really put the conflict behind? And which is ultimately, I think, the aspiration.
There was one point where, in these negotiations that were going on, and the negotiations start up, people become optimistic, and then they disappear, and then they go back to their corners of the ring again. But there was one point that it was suggested that 90% of the disagreements actually are agreed to in terms of no entry into NATO for Ukraine, and I don't know what the 90% are, but we can speculate as to which one were, maybe Ukraine joining the EU ultimately, that wouldn't be problematic. Having some kind of security guarantee for both states, that wouldn't be problematic. Donbass is probably part of the 10%.
Right. Well, I think, NATO, Ukraine entering NATO, my sense is out of the question at this point. I mean, there's no scenario, at least in the realm of the conceivable near future where Ukraine enters NATO. I mean, that itself might be a victory for Putin, sort of stopping that conversation about Ukraine. But will it be a defeat for NATO? Because the rhetoric has long been, this is a sovereign decision, and this, Russia is not going to dictate, and this is for the Ukrainians to decide, etc. So to the extent that the NATO accepts that it's not an option, there may need to be some creative framing so it doesn't look like a defeat.
What makes it easy is for Ukraine to withdraw the request, which it already has. I mean,
right.
Rather than NATO being told that can't happen from Putin's point of view. So I don't even think this is a contentious issue anymore, frankly.
Yeah, right. I'm going to actually jump in on that point too, because I think that is one of the problems with how NATO has behaved. They've always said, "Oh, this is a sovereign decision." Well, it's a sovereign decision of all the NATO states to accept the invitation, and it's been clear for a long time that the public stance of NATO, making them look so great, was open invitation, but in fact there was not consensus. And that's what, and Zelensky, I think, as Robin has said, has clearly taken it. He recognized that, and he said it in a very poignant way about being led. Essentially, we believed the door was open, but now we understand we will not enter there. So he has understood the true situation with respect to NATO. So it's not that they're giving, it's the public posture of NATO. It's NATO coming clean that's required. And I just wanted to pick up on one other thing, and that is, there was a great deal of agreement, yes, with respect to all of the outstanding issues, some of them being punted down the road, like this will be the subject of consultation over X number of years. But the last time, where the negotiation seems to have faltered is because the United States made it absolutely clear that, they're not engaging, and they're not engaging on security guarantees. And so it shouldn't be problematic, except that, the West is not indicating that they have any interest in providing these security guarantees, which could be rather straightforward. But right. I just want to come back. Well, we've got a few questions here. We can go till 2:15 to some of them. You've answered parts of them, a lot of parts of them already. But I wanted to come back on this point about, which I think is very important, which is, which Cesar emphasized, but you've both talked about what is the end goal here, clarifying the end goal. And of course, Robin emphasizing the importance of a negotiated settlement. And I want to come back to the Globe and Mail editorial, because of course, the Canadian position, such as it is, the position of both the Deputy Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister is that Putin must be vanquished. Mm-hmm. So that's the all or nothing. That's Putin, fighting. That's getting rid of, fighting to the last, down to the last Ukrainian, to vanquish Putin. And that, again, I use Robin's terms, why the Globe and Mail editorial is so extraordinary, because they are directly responding to that. We need to be careful, I'm quoting, to signal to Russia that our goals do not extend beyond Ukraine's border. We are not aiming at regime change across the border in Russia. But as Robin as Cesar has pointed out, that's not clear. I mean, NATO hasn't made that clear in any way, and that would be a welcome step forward.
My concern, Canada-wise, I'm sure it's shared here, but is that there's very little voice for the holding back of rhetoric, and it's I don't even know you could call it partisanship, because virtually everybody is speaking from the same platform in Canada from political parties' points of view. But there doesn't seem to be a great deal of risk in being a little more careful in the rhetoric. Unless unless somebody's looking at votes ahead. I don't know. It would seem to me a much smarter approach to say, to not say, the Russian regime must end, or the Russian military must be weakened to the extent that this can never happen again. I mean, you can think it, but the urgency now is not that wider balance of powers. The urgency is to end the war, so that the Ukrainians and Russian soldiers, for that matter, don't get killed in large numbers further. Right. So we need to redirect this, and particularly by the Canadian government. I mean, I'm not sure that I think Canada was being a little cautious at the beginning. I'm not sure whether the caution is thrown to the wind now, but.
Yeah, I mean, that speaks, Robin, in a way to what I was trying to hint at earlier with the lamentation about the lack of political leadership in the West, about making, showing a bit of moderation, showing a bit of caution, restraint. And I think that the trajectory seems to be in the opposite direction, more emboldened, tougher rhetoric, and a bit of a let's show Putin who's who, and that sort of thing. And in the West, there's no greater political sin than seeming weak on national security grounds. So there's that, and no one wants to be accused of the lack of preparedness, military or otherwise, for the threats we're facing. But I think the point Peggy made earlier is absolutely crucial. NATO is not underprepared militarily. We're outspending Russia, but not like by a little bit, by orders of magnitude. I mean, people perhaps fail to realize that NATO, and you take out the nuclear component, just on the conventional weapons, it's like a scary sort of level of military gear that NATO has, and it could obliterate and inflict damage. I don't want to say comparable to nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons are so vastly destructive, but very bad damage just on the conventional weapons front. So if the implication or insinuation is that NATO is somehow sort of underinvested militarily, etc. I mean, that's a fallacy. I mean, if anything, Russia is David, and NATO is Goliath from a military perspective. So I think that needs to be always kept from the front and center, especially if the justification for further military spending is we're not nearly prepared enough. That is not true. We have tons of weapons. And the point about 2% in particular, and I mentioned earlier again because it's a point he makes frequently. That's an economic measure that has nothing to do with actual threat levels and threat perception. So there's something arbitrary about that to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, just to reinforce what you just said. There's no indication that weakness by NATO, shortage of nuclear weapons, unmodernized nuclear weapons had anything to do with this conflict. It had nothing to do with it, right? The only element is the excuse, legitimate or not, the grievance of Putin regarding NATO's expansion. And we know that need not be a contentious issue because Ukraine is willing to no longer consider joining NATO, right? And the irony, of course, is that the chances of NATO expanding now are heightened. It's
with Finland and Sweden.
That's right. So this was the goal of Putin is not realized, and the argument by NATO that NATO's weakness that needs to be corrected somehow led to Putin's invasion. I mean, it's like all of the conversation is wrong.
Yep.
I feel we've got questions here. We're not going to, I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all of them. I think I'm going to take on one right away just because we can quickly deal with it. And it's the end, and then we can go, as I said, we have answered some. But the end of Aaron Ray's question is, if Ukraine still had strategic nuclear capability and NATO membership, do we still assume Russia would still have been invaded? Well, of course, we've answered the NATO membership part. I mean, if it had been a member of NATO, it wouldn't have been invaded, but it never, I mean, that's really not it was never a realistic option. But I want to react to the if Ukraine still had. Ukraine has never had a strategic nuclear capability. It had on its soil a significant stockpile of Soviet nuclear weapons, which Russia, as the successor state, controlled and possessed the nuclear codes for. So Ukraine was not in a position to use those weapons. It wasn't even in a position to maintain those weapons. So this mythology has grown up. Also, the really important thing to recognize is that at the time, the whole momentum was reducing nuclear weapons. There were huge reductions going on and planned between Russia and United States. And the entire international community was engaged and supporting of that. And it was unthinkable that there would be a new nuclear weapon state. And in fact, the UN Security Council had declared that any new nuclear weapon state will be seen as a standing threat to international peace and security. So it was never an option for Ukraine, even if Ukraine had had the capacity to exercise the option, which it did not. So I've taken the opportunity to answer that because this is one of these myths that will not go away.
Right. Let me extend the question. Maybe it'll incorporate other questions too. I mean, the logical spread from that question is that, if every country had nuclear weapons, then nobody would use them because nuclear deterrence works. So therefore we should, I mean, there's a certain logic to that point, right? Which is that, okay, nobody is going to use nuclear weapons. So all the wars will be conventional, as if that's okay. But the alternative, well, let's put in the risks of everybody having nuclear weapons. We're talking about things going off, things being interpreted as a nuclear attack, increasing dramatically the risk of a small or large nuclear war happening. The alternative to that is no nuclear weapons. That one is obviously safer. It does mean that if we have no nuclear weapons, we have to have a form of security that doesn't lead back to nuclear weapons. So you can't just have, conventional wars because somebody will get the bright idea. Well, if I had a nuclear weapon, then then I could win this conventional war. So you'd have that breakout and return to nuclear weapons. So you have to have. That's why common security, cooperative security, is really the only alternative to proliferation of nuclear weapons. Or the dictate of nuclear weapon states who, as we know, are now putting the world on the edge because of these threats of escalation and so on. So I really think we are. I mean, we have always been, like Cesar said before, there's nothing new here. We've always been on the cusp of this choice of abolition of nuclear weapons and common security, or high risk, eventually leading to possible nuclear weapons use.
Right, and not just on the security front, of course, common security, but I think this in turn leads to other forms of interdependence that are desirable. I think the end game, with what sometimes are called rogue players, Iran, perhaps, Russia right now, certainly, has to be integration. But we're moving towards exclusion, towards more militarized approaches, etc. We need to integrate them fully into the community states to reap the benefits of being part of that community states and have economic interdependence and have expats working here and working there and coming and going, and that decreases the likelihood of armed conflict. It really does historically. That's why Brexit. I'm going on a tangent. That's why Brexit was such a sad sort of a turn of events, because it's the opposite of integration, the type of which has benefits on the security realm, on the economic realm, on the social realm, and decreases the likelihood of armed conflict because you're integrated, and it just makes less sense. So again, I fear that the trajectory is not, will be towards further isolation of Russia, further militarizing of the relations, and this in turn will create the perceived conditions where even nuclear weapons might be necessary, or a nuclear weapons deterrent, and that's the worst possible outcome of this crisis.
I'm going to turn again to, because I feel duty bound to go to the rest of Aaron Ray's question, because I think he's launched a provocative question to both of the panelists. And so what he has said is non-NATO states without regional security have limited options for not being in the Russian orbit sphere of dominance. This is what's driving those states to Western security cooperation. Why is the assumption that European security should be held hostage by Russian expansionist, imperial, aggressive demands? If Russia is unwilling to comply with treaty regional security, create common frozen conflicts, how would a common security framework work in Europe? I mean, you get the gist of the rest of it. Yeah. So I wonder, okay, so Robin, do you want to try that first, and then
I will just tickle this question.
This is going to be the last. I think we're running out of time. I apologize to everyone for not I think we've touched aspects of most of the questions.
So, I mean, we're back to stark choices between states with different orientations or different political objectives that may or may not be militarily achieved. And a more cooperative society, or cooperative Europe, where those differences can be ameliorated, or it can be resolved diplomatically without threat. I don't know, in the case of Putin, to what extent we must listen to his list of grievances. But there are legitimate grievances beneath Putin himself. And forget leadership there. Forget about what Putin might lead Europe into. There are things that have to be resolved regardless of the leaders that are in play. And I don't know how to make this more clear, other than the question kind of implies, should we go along with Putin because he's making these threats, and shouldn't we just disqualify any conversation, any diplomatic channel because he has these ulterior goals? I don't think you can ever give up on the diplomatic channel, and it does not necessarily mean that a powerful state will not continue to be aggressive. Then we do need some kind of enforcement measures that are through the UN, preferably not through a partisan NATO arrangement. So then we get into a whole area about what are the military structures through the UN that are palatable to everyone. It's a very complicated problem that is highlighted by the fact that we have powerful states with different goals.
Thank you very much. Okay, Cesar, the last word here, and I thank everyone, for putting up all these great questions, and we have not been able to get to all of them.
Thank you, Peggy and Robin. I've learned a lot from listening to you. I won't do justice to any sort of last word, sort of recap, but just on the point of sphere of influence, a bit related to the question that was raised, which I think is a valid and provocative question, so we need to think about. Question of sphere of influence, the question of sovereignty. Sometimes I read in analysis, etc., that the former is outdated and the latter is the only factor. There's no such thing as sphere of influence. Those are outdated Cold War terms, and it's all about sovereignty, having given Ukraine the sovereign ability to make its decision, including about whether or not to join NATO. And I would say, like, spheres of influence, without entering into the merit of that concept itself, is it really outdated? I mean, if you look at the West, are there no spheres of influence? Are there no countries that are clearly in the economic and political grip of the United States, and that would face consequences if they tried to break away from that grip? And then look at Venezuela, look at other examples. There's political tensions. Of course, there's sort of a gravitational pull to big states in certain regions of the world. And when the global superpowers, of course, there's, including today, some form of sphere of influence. Who can deny that? And on the question of sovereignty, I think it's also a term that needs to be qualified. No one denies sovereignty, and I'm a big defender and proponent of sovereignty of states. But also within the realization that sovereignty also includes some level of analysis about how your neighbors feel in terms of the security of your neighbors, the security of the implications of the security arrangements that you make. I'd be hard pressed to believe that the U.S. would concede that on the basis of sovereignty, Mexico could freely join a Russian anti-American military alliance, because it's a question of sovereignty. Of course not. It'd be seen as a grave threat because they're next door, and because there's an expectation that sovereignty also take into account the security of their neighbors. So yeah, just that there's a lot of black and white explanations to this crisis, and I think let's look at the grays, because there's a lot of nuances that get lost in some of these analyses.
Thank you both very much. I think what we've shown here with all these questions we've got, wonderful questions we've got from the audience that we haven't been able to get to, I think this shows that this is a topic that we just scratched the surface of, and that really we need a lot more discussion. The tragedy is that none of this discussion really, except in the Globe and Mail editorial, is reflected in the mainstream media, which is really a one-note Charlie on just arm, and go for broke. So I once again, I thank our two speakers very, very much. And I thank our audience and all the people who've put up very excellent questions. Hopefully some aspects of them we have been able to answer. Thank you all very, very much.
Thanks to you, Peggy.
Thanks a lot, Peggy. See you, Cesar.